The more you chase, the more they pull away, until you stop chasing and their world becomes unstable. That's the dynamic so many people find themselves trapped in when dealing with someone with an avoidant attachment style. It begins subtly, you connect, there's chemistry, things feel promising, then they start to withdraw, not completely, just enough to leave you guessing. You sense their shift, and your instinct is to close the gap. So you reach out more, you offer reassurance, you try to prove your value, you become emotionally invested in fixing what feels like it's slipping away, and that's the trap, because every time you move toward an avoidant, their reflex is to move away. Not because you're too much, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because their defense system tells them closeness is dangerous to them, intimacy feels like exposure, vulnerability feels like risk. So they self-protect, they create distance, they guard their emotions by creating a false sense of independence, and when you chase them, it confirms what they fear most, that love comes with pressure, with expectation, with a demand they're not ready to meet. The problem is, when you chase, it validates their need to avoid. You teach them that they can disconnect whenever they feel uncomfortable, and you will be the one to do the emotional work, that if they back off, you'll come forward. And that sets the entire dysfunctional cycle in motion. They become the one who controls the emotional pace of the relationship. And you become the one anxiously waiting for crumbs of connection, thinking that if you just show enough love, enough patience, enough loyalty, they will finally feel safe enough to love you back fully. But here's what they don't expect. The moment you stop chasing, their world begins to crumble. When you stop responding to the push-pull dynamic, when you stop trying to solve their confusion with clarity, when you stop explaining yourself or begging for emotional scraps, you send a message that shocks them. You disrupt the pattern they've grown comfortable in, and that disruption reveals something deeply unsettling for them. Control is gone, power is gone, and the game of emotional cat and mouse that they've silently been playing. It no longer works. You see, avoidants don't expect you to understand what's really happening. They rely on the idea that you'll feel confused, insecure, maybe even unworthy. They assume you'll internalize their silence or detachment as a reflection of your value. But the moment you understand that their behavior isn't about you, but about them, you take away their biggest advantage. You stop making their distance about your deficiencies. You stop running after someone who's running from themselves. And instead, you pull all of that energy back into you. This is the turning point, because the moment you withdraw your attention, not in bitterness or punishment, but in clarity and peace, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of your absence. Not because they're suddenly healed, not because they're suddenly ready to change, but because you've stopped participating in the dynamic that allowed them to stay emotionally safe without being emotionally accountable. Now they're left with silence, and that silence becomes a mirror. It reflects their own inability to stay connected, their tendency to sabotage intimacy, their fear of being known, and while they might not show it on the surface, internally, it destabilizes them. Why? Because their biggest fear isn't being alone. It's being alone and realizing no one is coming to rescue them anymore, that the one person who saw past their walls, the one who kept trying, has stopped trying. And that, more than anything, shakes the foundation of their emotional comfort zone. This is when the avoidant begins to feel the loss, but more importantly, this is when you begin to feel free, free from the cycle. Free from the emotional guessing game, free from the belief that you have to chase love to keep it, and once that clarity sets in, you no longer react to their pullbacks with anxiety, you respond with indifference. You no longer feel the urge to explain yourself to someone who isn't emotionally available. You stop taking responsibility for someone else's healing journey and start focusing entirely on your own. That's when everything shifts. Because avoidants aren't used to people who walk away peacefully. They're used to chaos, to people begging for answers, to emotional turmoil. But when you walk away with grace, with dignity, and without resentment, that's when they begin to feel the true impact of what they've lost. Not just the relationship, but access to someone who once loved them through their fear, someone who saw through their armor, someone who refused to abandon themselves in order to be accepted. So remember this: chasing never brings connection. It only reinforces avoidance, but the moment you stop chasing, the avoidant is faced with a reality they can no longer ignore. The absence of your presence is louder than your words ever were, and that's when the crumble begins. Not because you forced it, but because you finally understood and chose peace over pursuit. Avoidants crave closeness but fear intimacy. They test how much you'll tolerate their distance. It's a paradox that leaves many people in relationships emotionally exhausted. On the surface, someone with an avoidant attachment style may appear independent, self-sufficient, or even emotionally unavailable. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior lies a very real, very human desire for connection. They want love, they want closeness, but the moment they start to feel it growing, their inner alarms go off. Intimacy threatens their sense of emotional control, and that control is everything to them. This is where the testing begins. It's rarely conscious. Most avoidants don't wake up and decide to emotionally manipulate you. It's more subtle, more rooted in their survival instincts. As soon as they start to sense that the relationship is getting closer, they pull back. Sometimes they do it by going silent for a few days. Other times they become distant, short, or irritable. They may suddenly start emphasizing their need for space, their busy schedule, or how they don't want to rush things. But what's really happening is they are testing the emotional environment. They want to see what happens when they create space. Will you panic? Will you chase? Will you over-explain, over-apologize, or bend over backwards to make them feel comfortable again? And here's the hard truth. If you do, it reinforces their belief that intimacy is dangerous, that closeness comes with pressure, that someone getting too close means they'll lose their freedom or be expected to emotionally perform in ways they don't feel capable of. Every time you shrink yourself to accommodate their emotional distance, they feel a sense of temporary relief, but they also lose respect, not necessarily for you as a person, but for your boundaries. And the dynamic becomes skewed. They become the one who sets the terms of connection, and you become the one constantly adjusting, adapting, and waiting for scraps of closeness. This constant testing can be emotionally draining. You start to question yourself. Am I too needy? Am I moving too fast? Should I give more space? But the issue isn't that you want closeness. The issue is that you're trying to connect with someone who fears the very thing they desire. Avoidants are like people standing at the edge of the pool, wanting to swim but terrified of drowning. So they dip a toe in and quickly jump back. And you, being emotionally open and willing, end up treading water alone, waiting for them to finally feel safe enough to join you. What you need to understand is that avoidants measure your reactions more than your words. They look for signs of pressure, neediness, or expectations because to them, those are red flags. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because their internal narrative tells them that emotional closeness is dangerous, so they test your tolerance for ambiguity, distance, and inconsistency. If you accept it without protest, they continue the pattern. If you challenge it with anger or desperation, they feel justified in pulling away even more. But there's a third option, one that disrupts their entire strategy. It's the calm, confident boundary. It's not about punishing them or playing games. It's about knowing your worth enough to say, I'm not going to chase connection with someone who's running from it. When you refuse to overfunction in the relationship, when you stop explaining yourself to someone who goes silent, when you stop rewarding emotional distance with more effort, that's when the testing loses its power. You show them, through action, that love doesn't have to be chaotic or manipulative, that your affection isn't unconditional to the point of self-abandonment, and this is where things get interesting. because avoidants often crumble under the weight of a partner who doesn't play their game. When you stay grounded in your own emotional truth and refuse to tolerate hot and cold behavior, you're not just protecting yourself, you're exposing their pattern, you're holding up a mirror to their fear. And while they may not immediately change, they will feel the shift. Your refusal to tolerate inconsistency forces them to reckon with the parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. This is not about trying to fix the avoidant. It's about refusing to bend your emotional needs to accommodate someone else's unresolved trauma. You teach people how to treat you not by what you say, but by what you allow. And when someone realizes that you won't be manipulated by silence or guilted into chasing them, it forces them to confront their own emotional limits. So when they test you with distance, let them. Let them sit in their silence. Let them feel your absence instead of your effort, because the people who truly want love, and not just the safety of control, will rise to meet you, and those who can't won't. But either way, you protect your peace, you stay anchored, you become the storm they can't shake, not because you raged, but because you stayed still. When an avoidant starts to notice that you're no longer waiting by the phone, no longer anxiously trying to decode their mixed signals, something unsettling begins to happen inside them. The silence they once used as a shield suddenly becomes a mirror, one that reflects the growing distance between you. At first, they may pretend not to notice. They convince themselves they're fine, that you were getting too close anyway, that they needed the space. But as the days go on, that silence doesn't feel as peaceful as they thought it would. It becomes loud, uncomfortable. It starts to echo. Here's what's really happening. Avoidants aren't immune to connection. They just fear its consequences. When they initially pull away, they often believe they're regaining control. But what they don't expect is that you might actually walk away. You might actually stop calling, stop texting, stop trying. And that's when their internal narrative begins to shift. It's no longer about keeping space. It's about what's now missing from that space. Because while you were showing up with love, vulnerability, and consistency, they were measuring how far they could push. They assumed you'd always be there, always reach out, always forgive the distance. But when you don't, when you match their silence with silence, not as a punishment, but as protection, they start to feel it. The absence, the difference, you become more noticeable in your silence than you ever were in your presence. Avoidants tend to miscalculate your strength. They often mistake your emotional availability for weakness, not realizing that being open, honest, and consistent in a world that teaches you to play games is one of the strongest things you can do. But when you pull back, not out of anger, but out of clarity, they feel it in ways they weren't prepared for, because now they don't know where they stand. Now they're the ones left with questions. And this uncertainty begins to challenge the story they've told themselves, that they were the one in control. You see, true emotional detachment doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't chase, it disappears quietly. And that silence, especially from someone who once cared deeply, unsettles an avoidant more than any argument or outburst ever could, because they expected drama. They expected to be begged to stay. They expected emotional chaos that would justify their withdrawal. What they didn't expect was grace, calm, detachment. That is what throws them off balance. They may start testing again, liking an old photo, sending a vague text, asking how you've been. Not because they're suddenly ready to connect fully, but because they need to know they still have emotional access. They need to know the door is still open, but how you respond, or don't, sends a message louder than words. You're not the same person who once accepted breadcrumbs. You've evolved, and now they're unsure if they can reach you at all. And that uncertainty, that shift in dynamic, that's what cracks their emotional wall. Because for perhaps the first time, they are experiencing a version of you they can't predict. They don't know if you're still waiting or if you've really moved on. That ambiguity becomes their anxiety. They begin to revisit the memories, replay the conversations, question their decisions, not because they were never sure about you, but because they were never sure how to love you without fearing they'd lose themselves. Now they're the ones who start overthinking, wondering if they misjudged the situation, realizing that what they fear, intimacy, closeness, vulnerability, wasn't the threat. The real threat was losing someone who loved them despite the walls. And suddenly, that silence they thought they wanted becomes the very thing they want to escape. But here's what matters most. You don't break that silence just to ease their discomfort. You don't reach back out to validate their ego. If they want connection, it has to come from a place of truth, of presence, of real emotional availability. Anything less just restarts the cycle. Your job is not to chase clarity from someone who speaks in confusion. Your job is not to keep the connection alive while they drift in and out. Your power lies in your stillness, in letting them face the discomfort they tried to avoid, in allowing your absence to be the lesson they needed. So yes, when you stop chasing, when you stop filling in the silence with apologies, explanations, or emotional labor, they feel it deeply. They may not show it, they may not say it, but internally they are confronting a truth they've avoided for too long, that losing someone who genuinely cared for them wasn't a relief, it was a regret. Would you like me to expand the fourth keynote as well? Avoidants aren't cold-hearted, they're cautious. What looks like emotional detachment is often just emotional self-preservation. But when the person they've been pushing away finally steps back, not out of punishment, but out of peace, it forces them into a confrontation they've spent years avoiding, their own feelings. And what they often find in that space is not relief, but confusion. Maybe even grief. It's in your silence, in your absence, that their emotional defenses begin to crack, not because you tried to make them feel something, but because you stopped trying at all. This is the paradox. While they run from emotional intimacy, they also long for it. But the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of getting hurt, and the fear of losing themselves in someone else keeps them in limbo. That limbo becomes their safe zone. So they build walls, they avoid too many conversations, they dodge commitments, and when things start to feel too real, they retreat. They think they're protecting themselves from pain, but what they don't realize is that they're slowly pushing away the one thing they actually need, connection. That's why when you begin to show signs of detachment, true, centered, non-reactive detachment, it sends a ripple through their emotional system. It's not the silence itself that unsettles them, it's the meaning behind it. Silence from someone who was once emotionally open speaks volumes. It says, I no longer need to chase this. I no longer need to prove my worth. I'm at peace without this tug-of-war. And that is terrifying to someone who is used to having the upper hand in emotional distance. Suddenly, your stillness becomes louder than any words. They begin to sense the energetic shift. You're no longer seeking approval, no longer orbiting around their inconsistency. You've stepped out of their emotional game. And in doing so, you remove the one thing they depended on, your emotional reliability. They always knew you'd be there. They always assumed you'd try to fix things. They trusted that your care would outweigh their avoidance. But now they aren't so sure, and that makes them uncomfortable. This discomfort forces a form of emotional reckoning. For some, it triggers realization. They begin to reflect on what they've lost and why. For others, it might trigger defensiveness. They may try to convince themselves that you were too much, or that the connection was doomed anyway. But in both scenarios, your decision to stop chasing has disrupted their internal story. You are no longer part of the predictable pattern, and that unpredictability makes space for a truth they can't ignore. They miss you, but here's the catch. They won't always say it. Avoidants rarely lead with emotional expression. Admitting they miss you, that they regret how they handled things, or that they still think about you. That's a level of vulnerability they're not always ready for. So instead, you might see subtle signs. A random message, a question that doesn't match the level of distance they've created, an attempt to reopen the door without fully stepping through it. It's not always sincere reconnection. It's often a test. They want to know if you're still emotionally available, if you're still the safety net. This is where many people make the mistake of re-engaging too quickly. The desire for closure, the hope that they've changed, or the longing for connection causes people to respond too eagerly. But if they haven't done the inner work, if they haven't taken accountability, if they haven't shown growth, then you're stepping back into the same cycle. The only difference now is that you've shown them you're still reachable, and that gives them the freedom to continue the hot and cold behavior. The power lies in not being available for patterns that drained you. It's not about punishing anyone, it's about protecting your peace. When someone who once feared connection begins to miss your presence, it creates an opportunity, but only if they choose to meet you where you are. Only if they are willing to confront the very emotions they've been avoiding. You can't do that work for them. You can't teach them the value of connection by diminishing your own needs. They have to decide to show up, not perfectly, but authentically. And if they don't, that silence, that space you've created, becomes the most powerful statement you could ever make. It says, I was here, I cared, I tried, and when it no longer served my growth, I let go. That is strength. That is self-love, and whether they admit it or not, that is what stays with them long after the silence sets in. There's a moment, often delayed, when the avoidant realizes that the person they distanced themselves from is no longer emotionally tethered to them. And that moment is unsettling. At first, they may have convinced themselves that you would always be there, always waiting, always hoping. They believed their distance would be met with your persistence, their silence with your concern. But over time, what they expected doesn't happen. You stop showing up. You stop reaching out. And rather than being relieved, they're left confused. Why? Because they suddenly feel the loss of control. Avoidants often thrive on control, not in a manipulative or malicious way, but as a defense mechanism. Controlling the emotional pace of a relationship allows them to feel safe. It allows them to keep connection at a distance that feels manageable. So when they see that you've removed yourself from the equation, not out of resentment but out of clarity, it disrupts that emotional rhythm. Suddenly, the person who once responded immediately, who always kept the connection alive, has gone quiet. That silence isn't just absence, it's a disruption of their perceived power. Here's the truth. Nothing challenges an avoidance narrative more than being peacefully ignored. Not blocked, not ghosted, not yelled at, just quietly released. Why? Because it forces them to confront the consequences of their detachment. They assumed their inconsistency would never cost them anything. They thought your love was unconditional in a way that would absorb every withdrawal. But now, without the reassurance of your presence, they're left to sit with the one thing they tried to avoid all along, their own emotions. In that silence, they begin to realize the emotional investment you brought to the table. It wasn't just your words or your attention. It was the safety, the loyalty, the emotional depth you offered. That emotional depth wasn't weakness. It was value. And only now, when it's gone, do they start to recognize what they took for granted. They start to question why you walked away. Was it something they did? Was it something they failed to do? The overthinking begins, and with it, a slow, burning regret. But here's where it gets more complex. Avoidants don't always process this regret openly. They don't suddenly call you crying. They may not even admit they miss you. What they often do instead is linger. They check your stories. They text you randomly. They resurface in passive ways that don't require vulnerability. Because part of them wants access to you again, but only if it doesn't threaten their emotional walls. So they flirt with the idea of closeness without fully committing to it. This is when you must remember the power of your emotional boundary. Their regret is not your responsibility. Their resurfacing isn't always a sign of growth. You have to watch what they do more than what they say. Are they consistent? Are they emotionally present? Or are they just reacting to the loss of control? Because if it's the latter, you're not reconnecting. You're just being reabsorbed into a cycle that will repeat itself. The most empowering thing you can do in this moment is to stay grounded. Don't let nostalgia pull you back into something you had to heal from. If their behavior hasn't fundamentally changed, then their regret is just discomfort, not transformation. And you're not here to soothe someone else's emotional consequences when they refuse to show up for the relationship when it mattered. Your silence was not just a reaction. It was a statement. It said, I will no longer negotiate for the bare minimum. I will no longer convince someone to choose me. I will no longer make space for emotional unavailability. That message may not be spoken aloud, but they feel it. And that feeling stays with them far longer than any argument or closure conversation ever could. Over time, if they truly begin to reflect, some avoidants do reach a point where they're willing to do the emotional work. They come back with honesty, with clarity, with presence, but even then, your role is not to rescue them. Your role is to discern whether their change is real and sustainable. Not everyone who regrets losing you is ready to meet the standards you now hold. And that's okay. Growth is never about proving your worth to someone else. It's about honoring it yourself. So let them sit with their silence. Let them feel the gap your presence used to fill. Let them wrestle with the questions they never wanted to face. Because in that space, in that stillness, they're forced to confront the truth. They didn't lose someone who was desperate for love. They lost someone who knew how to love deeply and who finally learned to love themselves more. When an avoidant realizes you've truly moved on, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in peace, it begins to dismantle the carefully constructed identity they built around emotional detachment. Your absence isn't just physical, it's energetic. There's no more pursuit, no more waiting, no more emotional availability. And that creates a vacuum. But more than anything, it triggers something deeper than regret. It sparks a crisis of identity within them, because in their minds, they always believed they could keep one foot in and one foot out. They thought you'd always be there, emotionally invested, patiently waiting while they figured things out on their own timeline. But when you walked away with calm clarity, it rewrote the story entirely. What was once a connection they could control now becomes a loss they can't ignore, and they may try to convince themselves, and others, that it doesn't affect them. They'll put on a front. They'll act unbothered. They'll even say they're relieved, but these performances are hollow, and over time they start to collapse, because no one walks away from something meaningful and stays untouched by it forever. Even the most emotionally guarded people have moments when the mask slips. And in those moments, it's not just you they miss, it's who they were when they were with you. They miss the safety of being seen without being judged. They miss the comfort of your consistency. They miss the way you forgave without enabling, loved without smothering, and stayed without begging. And as that realization dawns, it often doesn't come with a triumphant chase or grand gesture. Instead, it shows up in subtle shifts, in increased anxiety, unresolved curiosity, quiet checking in. They become haunted by the what if. What if they hadn't pulled away? What if they had just opened up? What if they hadn't been so afraid of being known? Here's the truth. Avoidants struggle most when they finally feel safe enough to care, but find the door already closed. When the threat of emotional closeness has passed, when you're no longer available, it gives them a window to feel what they couldn't handle before. But now, with the safety of distance, they find themselves wanting what they once rejected. And that contradiction becomes a torment, because desire without access is painful, and the more they sit with that, the more they realize how much they relied on your emotional presence, even if they never said so out loud. This is the moment their silence begins to scream. You won't hear them say, I miss you, but you might sense it in a delayed message, a song they post, a memory they randomly reference. You won't hear them apologize, but you might notice they're still watching your stories, still following your moves. These are signs of someone grappling with a loss they never thought they'd feel, because what they once dismissed as emotional intensity now feels like emotional richness. And they start to recognize that the very vulnerability they feared was the exact thing that made you valuable. But here's the catch. Just because someone feels the loss doesn't mean they're ready to heal or return. Some people never move beyond recognition. They realize what they had, they mourn what they lost, but they still lack the tools or courage to meet you in the emotional space you needed from the beginning. And it's in this space that your growth becomes most essential, because your job was never to save them from themselves. Your peace is not a tool to make them change. It's a declaration that says, I love myself enough not to chase someone who isn't ready. You walking away doesn't make you cold. It makes you whole. It means you recognized a pattern that kept you stuck and chose freedom over familiarity. And whether or not they ever express it, they will feel the echo of your love long after you're gone. That echo is the reflection of what they weren't able or willing to receive. It is a reminder of what love looks like when it's given freely, not forcefully, and that is what stays with them. So let them deal with the silence. Let them carry the weight of what they couldn't hold. You don't need to be present for someone to feel your impact. You don't need to be in contact for someone to carry your memory. And you don't need to re-enter the story for them to finally read the chapter they ignored. Their silence no longer controls you. Their regret is no longer your responsibility, and your peace is no longer up for negotiation. That is where your power lies, not in making them realize what they lost, but in standing tall in what you found, yourself.